Thanks for joining us. And I'm Dr. Deborah Philbin, and I'm an art teacher at Bloom High School, and I've been teaching for well over 20 years. And I wanted to introduce my colleague, Adan Alvarado.
Hello, I'm Adan Alvarado, English teacher at Bloom High School. Have the good fortune of collaborating with this genius here. So we're going to be talking today about graphic novels and manga, comics and manga, art and ELA, cross-content collaboration. That's the title of our panel. It's going to be generally discussing a course that we came up with that does this sort of cross-disciplinary work between English and art.
So to give everybody a little bit of context and kind of lay the groundwork of how all of this started, this actually started quite a few years ago. And one thing we noticed was we had some students that we had shared that had taken both of our classes separately, or would come to art club, or would come to clubs that Adan has done, and he'll tell you about those. And what we noticed was not only were we sharing students, but we were starting to share ideas and images and words that students were creating. So this image was created by a student, and he had done a beautiful spoken word piece at our Black History Month celebration. And part of what he had said worked into this artwork. And we started to realize that some of these things were pretty significant. Here's another student that we had shared. And this student struggled with a lot of written assignments, however, was able to beautifully reflect what he had learned through creating visual images. So this image that he created was a response to a reading and a way that he had illustrated a quote from a reading. Another thing we noticed with a lot of students was just this excitement about fan art. And fan art just became such an important part of the students' conversations with each other and things that they always wanted to share with us. One thing that Adan had done with his colleague Adam Ebert was they made a lit mag, a literary magazine. And the beautiful thing, again, that we started to see when ideas got shared was a lot of these students that were providing written word were also providing images or creating images. So this was actually one of my students that created the cover art for one of the issues. But the thing that we found that it went deeper and much farther beyond just copying for fan art. It became a lot of original work. So these are some examples of how students started creating their own original ideas, their own characters, and just playing with character development. This eventually turned into students starting to create their own comics. And this one was really one of my favorites. This one obviously was created right after the start of the pandemic, when the students were home on remote instruction. And one of my students sent this to me as his view of what was happening, not only with the mask order, but the panic over toilet paper, which I found was just great. And you can see on the bottom left, there's the box or the package of toilet paper. And it was so interesting to see through students' eyes how they were perceiving these things, but also through that use of a comic or a multi-panel progression of sequential images to really reveal some of those things. So Adan is going to tell us a little bit about this course that we're proposing.
Yeah, so this course, obviously, it's like I said, across subjects. So Deb will be teaching one period, and I'll be teaching another. So kids will go from one of our classes to the other. And the idea behind that is we're going to be taking a look at comics, graphic novels, and manga, and we're going to be breaking those down and really sort of digging into like what makes, you know, this particular medium what it is. And the idea behind it is that as the English teacher, I'll be focusing on a lot of literary components, and then they'll be moving on to Deb's class and taking a look at the visual and design components of the medium itself, with the larger purpose of sort of expanding the notion of literacy, you know, beyond just words on a page. And I know a lot of people are doing a lot of good work in focusing on that visual literacy, on recognizing its value. And the focus is just that there's so much of what students consume now is visual, that they really need to be able to decode the messages in those images. And that's kind of what the class is going to be kind of figuring out how those two things work together, the visual component and the words, and how those are, you know, kind of meshing to create this really complex and interesting messages that so many of these works are, you know, are providing. So that's kind of the, in a nutshell, what our course is going to be looking to do. And I thought we'd just talk a little bit about why we decided to design a course in this way, right? Like why we decided to have it be a sort of cross-curricular collaboration, as opposed to just, you know, taking it on in the English department or in the art department. Why do this sort of cross-curricular planning? So, yeah, I thought for me, it was the graphic novel medium, comics and manga. It's so rich in terms of like all that it has to offer. Like there's these great narratives. There's these, you know, the design and the images and how they're working together is incredibly complex. And I think for me personally, I would be doing a disservice to students if I tried to tackle that all by myself. Because I think I could really dive into some of the narrative components and I could break that down really well when you talk about character development and the themes and how they're building a story and, you know, how all these things are working together. But when it comes to the visual components, like I can try to bring in some stuff, you know, and talk about, you know, the way that they're using space, and the way that they're using color and all these things, but that's not my area of expertise. So for me, like in a medium like this, that's, like I said, really complex, I think I would just be really selling it short if I tackled it on my own, when I have experts, you know, like Dr. Philbin in my school. That's like, yeah, obviously I'm going to go to her and be like, help me with this, because you're going to be able to talk about it. You know, other experts like Dr. Philbin will be able to talk about it, I think, in a way that's far more complex, far more nuanced than I ever could. So I think that's kind of the reason why I was thinking about, or you know, we started talking about that. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Dr. Philbin? Why cross curricular as opposed to?
I agree with you 100%, because I can help decode the construction, the design, the creating of the images, but that's my area of expertise. I am not the expert in understanding all the literature. I'll read manga or graphic novels or comics for fun for me, and I'll look at them in a totally different lens. I'll look at the way the page was laid out, or I'll look at the drawing style, but I won't critically examine the literary component as well as you would. So I think this was just such a natural, peanut butter and jelly going together, just great, or peas and carrots if you're allergic to peanut butter. But, and I think from the art end, I think what's really unique is a seasoned veteran art teacher for quite a while is, I got to tell you, when I started teaching art a long time ago, comics and were not part of the art curriculum at all. It was usually poo-pooed as not serious art. And A lot of art teachers shied away from covering that as part of the art curriculum. And throughout my experience, you know, I have always seen students show, whether I included it in the curriculum originally or not, students were always showing me their fan art or their comics or, I remember years ago, even, students showing me, drawing their Pokemon and things like that. Or they were making their own comic. And so I learned from my students, this is important and it means something to them and it engages them and it excites them. So why cut it out of the curriculum? So this was something I learned to embrace. It wasn't considered a fine art or a high art, but it was still a very important art form. And so as I started talking with my students and looking at the way they constructed their comics, I really learned from them the complexity and the high level of thought, and the high level of creativity that goes into that. Because it's not just a simple doodle. There's so much planning and design and organization involved. So,
And I think most people who would be watching this panel are probably fans of the medium. So I think you would know, more than, better than anybody, that you could really tell, like, when a comic looks beautiful but is poorly written, you're like, it's all right, it looks good. That's the first thing you say, like, it looks really good. Or, the opposite, when a comic is like got these brilliant ideas, but then the art's kind of like, it's all right. Like they need to be working in unison, right? And I think that's kind of what we're trying to do here, is that, like you said, I'm first drawn to like the story. And I think a large part of that is because I may not have the language to discuss the art, right? So even when I'm talking with friends, I'm like, yo, this story was great. Like, they're doing this with the medium. This is the way it was structured. It was non-linear, blah, blah, blah. But then when it comes under art, I was like, oh, it looked dope. Like, it was just like, it was kind of like grimy and stuff like that. And it kind of like, it was like really scratchy and almost looked like a metal cover. But like, I don't really have the language to discuss it, effectively. And I think that's what we're trying to give the students, right? The language to discuss not only the story, which is such an important component, but also the art that sort of brings all that to life. So, yeah, that's kind of the reason for the sort of cross-curricular idea. But with that, when you propose new courses, it goes through a process. So I was wondering, Dr. Philbin, if you could tell us a little bit of, tell people watching a little bit about what that was like. How was this course received by both our colleagues and administrators?
That was, and I think that's probably, I'll throw the word scary out at first, because it was a little scary at first when we started the process. But I think as the process unfolded, it became much more welcoming. So the first part of the process was we had to really, I think, explain and educate our colleagues and administrators that this is a serious discipline. There's some serious learning that's going to go on. There's some complex learning that's going to go on. And just because it's fun for the students doesn't make it any less important. So there definitely was some educating that we had to do for some of the administrators and some of our colleagues. I want to say, I think I'm correct in saying we had about a 50-50 reception initially to it when we initially proposed. Half the staff were kind of like, oh, this is a great idea. And half the staff was like, really?
yeah, that's
Come on,
and it was just like that, right? Like, the people who were about it were about it. Like, I had people stop me in the hall, like, even like counselors, like, oh my God, like, I can't wait to tell kids about this. But then it was the other part that was just like, comics, really?
Yeah.
Which seems crazy to people who love the medium, right? Because like I've been talking about comics in the classroom for like 7 years now. My buddies have been doing it for even longer than that, like going to different conventions and stuff like that, San Diego, New York, C2E2, and talking about these things. So for me, to a certain part, it's like, yeah, like that, like I thought this conversation was over, right? So it is nice to be like, no, it's not, right? Like there is that education aspect of it, like you're talking about, that still needs to take place. Because for a lot of people who aren't into comics, it's still like, oh, those things are from like the funny pages, right? In the newspaper, it's like these 4-panel like goofy things, and sometimes profound, like Charles Schultz, but still kind of silly. So yeah, I think that idea of educating those around us, I think, is a great way to look at that, because that's really what was required.
Yeah, I think one of our greatest, and I'll call it selling point, because it really truly was, and it wasn't anything we fabricated, but it was really sharing the notion of what literacy is and really explaining what visual literacy is and just how rich it is. And that was, I think, one of the biggest things when we put it in that context of literally giving it a name of visual literacy. Then some of those colleagues that were kind of like, really, they're like, oh, didn't think of it in that way.
Yep.
So it was a nice process. And I think I was also pleasantly surprised by the number of questions that people had for us. And while it was daunting to be,
Yes.
flooded with a lot of questions, on the other hand, it was really good because it meant people were like, we want to know more. Tell us more about this. Okay, you've got us interested. Keep the ball rolling.
Yeah, because it's rarely like if you go to if you're in one of those proposals and nobody has anything to say, it's rarely because they're blown away and are just like, amazing, I love this. It's always because they're like, wait, what? I don't care. Like, what is this person talking about, right? So like, yeah, that kind of engagement is always a good thing, because they're interested. They're like, this is cool, but like, what exactly are you trying to do here, right? Like, we need to know more. So that was dope.
So that was good. So Adan, what are some of the works that you're actually excited to include in the course?
Yeah, so that going along with like the visual literacy element was like a selling point too, right? Is we have to be like, yeah, so like maybe part, again, going back to the educating element, is that, yeah, maybe like your notion of what like comic books and manga are not exactly what's being offered right now. So kind of thinking that in mind, like some of the titles that we brought up and some of the titles that we're excited about bringing into the course, there's stuff like Inuyashiki, which is a great manga. It's by Hiroya Oku, and essentially what that manga is like, it's like kind of sci-fi. This sort of accident happens, and we're not trying to give too much away on it, but it's just an interesting manga to jump into, because what it does really well from like a storytelling perspective is it gives you that sort of basic good versus evil matchup in a really interesting way. But like the visuals are just insane. The art in that manga is just so complex, and so like nuanced, every detail in it, that it just really like, you're like, yo, this thing is like, it's beautiful, right? It's not just like, oh, here's these quick little these sketches that are being drawn. Like, these are complex, detailed images, and I think that work does that really well. I think even something like Girl's Last Tour is another good like manga, because it has this sort of a like juxtaposition that's created in that work, where the characters are super simplistic looking. They look, very much like your standard manga / anime characters, the big eyes, really, cute, not a lot of details. But then what's going on behind them is insane. Like it's like these very elaborate designs and like homes and like landscapes that are happening in front of these very simplistic characters. And again, it's just a really cool element to show like what this medium can do. There's Azumaki, which is a graphic novel by Junji Ito, and that's like that might be more of like an excerpt thing that we do, because like Akira, I think it's definitely a thing that is held up as like, this is art, right? Like going beyond just like the medium, but it's also like horrific. That's a horror novel, and it's not, I don't think, like anything that's too explicit, but it's just scary. Like it shows you like what you can do with these images too, that it can just be frightening, and what this medium can do. That's some of the manga I think would be cool to check out. Some of the comics / graphic novels. I mean, there's so much. If we're just looking at like what the medium could do, we take a look at like Chris Ware. His building stories is insane in terms of like what the medium is trying to do. My favorite thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris is just, it shows like it's taking the medium and really doing this sort of like mixed media approach to it, and really bringing all these other sort of mediums into comics, which is really cool. One thing I recently went to, we talked about this a little bit, Dr. Philbin, but I recently went to the MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Chicago, and they have a Chicago comics like exhibit right now. And one of the things that I didn't know is like an artist that me and my buddy Ronell really like is Kerry James Marshall. He's like a brilliant artist, sculptor, all sorts of things. But we didn't know he dabbled in comics as well. And in that exhibit, he's got this new, like, just like this strip called like Drum Solo, and it's just like I don't want to say the wrong thing, so I'm not sure how many panels it is, but it's just like long strip, 20 plus panels of this drummer in a jazz nightclub drumming while stuff's going on around him, all black, white, grayscale. It's unbelievable to see this thing. Like, it's like, I mean, this dude's an amazing artist, but to see him work in the medium, there's just like so much energy and there's like so much movement in his panels that you can like see this and you're like, yeah, it's really difficult to capture live music in a drawing, but like it also shows that if you're like a master at your craft, and that you can use all sorts of medium. And Kerry James Marshall's drum solo is just unbelievable. So just bringing in different stuff like that, right? Like bringing in like, not just, we'll use some of the tried and true, we'll use some of the fan favorites like, One Punch Man, because that art's really great as well. We'll take a look even at some superhero comics, but there's just so much stuff going on in the medium right now. We'll probably dive into zines as well, right? Like zines is a more simplistic component, but that's also good for the students as we talk about the sort of projects that they'll be working on. Seeing zines will be a good thing for them because they can see like, hey, I don't have to be Kerry James Marshall, or all these other, Chris Ware, these amazing artists to create in this medium. Here are these artists that are creating these zines who are also very good. I don't want to impugn their sort of ability, but they're focused on something else, right? They're focused on like, here's a DIY aspect. I'm not going to have an inker and a coloring and all that. I'm going to do it all on my own. It's going to be quick. It's going to be cool. It's going to be, something I really care about. So, and the MCA exhibit had that as well, right? It had this local artist Bianca Eunice who creates these amazing zines, and she was like kind of the subject of controversy earlier on during the lockdown because she had this one panel comic that like set the internet world on fire, and that was at the exhibit that said like it had a woman, a black woman in there, and she had a shirt that said "I can't breathe," and then it had a person right next to her that said, "Well, take off your mask," as she was wearing the mask for COVID safety. And the woman that's saying it would be depict it's a white woman, and people would call her Karen, right? It's that sort of typical illustration or the way you think of that sort of person. And it was one simple panel, right? Like in almost this sort of zine format, but it's it's set the internet ablaze, and people were talking about it, and she was the subject of a lot of scrutiny and a lot of praise. But that's the power of the medium. So we talk about zines too, and that if you have something to say and you know how to say it, which is what students will be learning in this class, you can say it, and what you have to say is valuable. So I think that kind of moves us nicely into what are we trying to do here in this class? What are we going to allow the students to say, and how are we going to allow them to say it? What projects are you thinking of for this class, Dr. Philbin?
I think one of the most exciting things is because the students are going to be transitioning between a literary course with you and then an art course with me. And, starting with you, the reading and the learning the literary construction to eventually them writing a story with me decoding and deconstructing the visual construction and then teaching the students, well, now how do you create your own, regardless of their artistic ability level. And that was one thing I think that came up with some fear of, well, what if I can't draw? Well, that's okay. Yeah, that's what we're here for. But I'm excited to see, what I really want to see is for students to create and write their own story, because I think students' voice is so unbelievably important and powerful. And I know throughout our experience, we have seen just how sharp and astute our students are to what is happening around them. But to give them a vehicle and a way to show it and tell it is so powerful. You know, I know so many times I'll have students that have a great idea, but get frustrated or stuck because they don't have the artistic knowledge to create it, or vice versa. They've got a good story to tell, but they don't know how to lay it out. So what I'm looking forward to as a final product for our class in lieu of a final exam is for the students to literally show and tell their story, and have a way for them to construct it almost like a portfolio presentation. They would do a presentation of their own work. So that I think is always really powerful.
Yeah, I'm super excited about just what we're going to be taking a look at in the class and just the class in general. But I'm super excited about the projects, right? I'm really excited about the projects that you're going to come up with. I know they're going to be amazing. And yet even talking about that, like giving the students, you know, that ability and that language to say what they have to say. And we're talking, that's been my concern too, is just like students who are like, I love this medium, but I don't draw, right? Like, but that's what I think it's cool too, is to be like, well, guess what? Like in this medium, not everybody is a drawer, right? Like you sometimes bring all these like incredible authors, right? Like you bring in Roxane Gay, you bring in Ta-Nehisi Coates, you bring in Eve Ewing, all these amazing writers just to write, right? So like maybe that's like what you have to say. That's going to be the collaborative aspect of this course. Not only from its inception, but throughout the entire course, there's going to be a collaboration element with students who can be like, I got something really cool to say. I got a really story percolating, and you know, maybe, you know, like I really like your art. Maybe we can collaborate on this and come up with this story. Like that's a cool thing too, right? Like showing them like storyboarding and how to put all this together, and communicating between artists and, you know, and creators to sort of convey their messages in the language that they're best at working in, right? Because there's also artists who are like, I can't write, right? Like I can draw, but like my story's gonna be real lame because I got nothing really to, you know, to say. So like that's cool too, is showing that collaborative component. And I'm really excited about just these little sort of like projects, you know, based assessments that we can have moving through the, you know, the course for the year. It's a lot of cool things. So.
And Dan, what do you think is the biggest benefit you see to teaching in a way that merges different disciplines into like this whole new format?
Yeah, so I think you know, I touched on this a little bit in the beginning, but like even thinking about this, you know, more broadly than just like, you know, art and English, which I think is kind of a sort of natural collaboration, right? Even if we think of something like, you know, manga or comics, it's sort of merging those two worlds already. But I think about like just about the process that we went through, and just thinking about like how, like, all right, like how are you going to come, you know, like to this idea or this project? Like what's going to be your perspective? What's going to be your ideas? And that like collaborating with you on that just made me see things that I wouldn't see otherwise, right? So I think it just gives you a bigger picture. It gives you, you know, just like all sort of collaboration does, is it allows you to see things from a different perspective. And for me, it makes me become a better teacher. It makes me become a teacher that's more aware of not only how other disciplines are looking at it, but how looking at it through those disciplinary lens, opens up a lot of things, right? Like opens up like, oh, like those art students that I have that are really great at art, like here's why they may not like this particular subject that I assigned them, right? Like that's not their language that they're comfortable working in. As we were talking about Jalen earlier, right? Like that's a student who was really struggling, right? And that's a student that I had, that you had, that he would just produce the most amazing things in your classes, right? I don't think we could talk about that dude enough in terms of his skill and his talent as an artist, but then it just wasn't happening for him in other classrooms, particularly ones in which he had to write, right? So it also kind of will help me become better in my core subject area, right? Where I'm like, all right, I'm an English teacher, and like, I hold writing to be incredibly important, right? As you do, as every educator does, right? Like, if you can't write and express yourself, then everything else kind of becomes difficult. But you also need to find other ways to help students express themselves on their way to becoming a better writer, right? Allowing them to express themselves in other ways, in other languages that they feel more comfortable in, unlocks perhaps that ability to open them up to becoming a better writer, or to be willing to write a little bit more. Even if we just think about something like this, an artist now who doesn't like to write is now going to be working with somebody who may fancy themselves a writer or likes to write, creatively. And now just through that process are going to be opening themselves up to reading and to thinking about writing and thinking about how to express themselves, using words as opposed to just always visually. So all those things sort of work together. And again, if we had worked on this course, as a collaboration, I don't think I would have thought a lot about those things. I would have thought, like, naturally my mind always goes towards narrative, right? Like, narrative's dope. This should be the focus. This is what we're talking about. Like, this brings up all these ideas, and it brings, it alludes to this philosophy, and it kind of, there's this quote from this author. I think about so many, these other like graphic novels, but like for some students who are in that class that I'm going on and on about this narrative, they're going to be like, yeah, but this visual right here is saying so much more, and that also needs to be important too. And I think that's what this does. It gives students that freedom. I remember vividly, I was sitting in a class and I was teaching students Spider-Man, right? The Ultimate Spider-Man. We were reading Ultimate Spider-Man, and we were reading, I was talking about the words, right? I was like, oh, Miles Morales is saying this, and his father's telling him this, and we're talking. And then one of the students like raised his hand. He was like, did you notice that he got bit by, the radioactive spider he got bit by? It had a 42 on it, right? Because it's a lab experiment, and they all have numbers on them. And I was like, oh, that's cool, man. Okay. And he was like, it's probably because Jackie Robinson was number 42, right? Miles Morales is a black Spider-Man. Jackie Robinson broke the color barriers. And I was like, bro, of course that's why that's there. But I read that comic 5, 6, 7 times and looked over that every single time because I'm drawn to the words. And sometimes I'm, I ignore some of the amazing artistic choices that are going on from a visual, perspective. So I think what this does is just allows, not only students, but educators to start thinking about the things that we consume and the things that we teach from multiple perspectives. So that's my biggest takeaway. It's the biggest benefit from where I'm coming from. How about you, Dr. Philbin?
I agree with you on so much of that. And there's so many stories I could tell about students that, struggled in the traditional academics, but flourished in the art room and things. But I think in us doing kind of this cross-curricular collaboration, my biggest hope is that our students and colleagues will see that learning doesn't happen in this little silo. It's not just English in an English class and algebra just an algebra class. And I think that was best illustrated to me one day. One of my students was struggling with something, and I've got this huge, I got a big bookshelf at home. I got a bigger bookshelf in my classroom, and I'm digging, and I hand the student an anatomy textbook because they were struggling with hands and hand structure. I mean, that's a hard thing for a lot of students. And the student just looked at me and goes, "You're an art teacher. What are you doing with an anatomy book?" But, seeing that, we have to know about history. to understand where did that reference to Jackie Robinson come from, and knowing your social history and knowing, scientific and this is where it all just comes together into this just great, exciting mixture. So I think that's my biggest hope and excitement, is that students and our colleagues are going to see that we all learn together, and I don't think any of us should learn isolated. It's just not as exciting then. Well, we
yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, we could go on forever. I don't think there's a better way to end than we should all learn together, and not in isolation.
If any of you, I should have one more slide. Let's see if we can get to it. No. Okay. Let me see if I can find that slide. There it is. Okay. Now, can you see it? Let me go back here. Let's share that. So if any of you wanted to follow up with either of us, please feel free. So there's Mr. Alvarado's information or my information. And if any of you have any questions or comments for us, we'll be happy to do that. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.